All right, well, as we've heard, these are not normal times. I think it's fair to say that as economists, we're all struggling with what has been the weirdest recession ever. And yet, things are obviously quite extreme. We've had the biggest fall in GDP in measured history. We've got the pandemic raging overseas and lockdowns being reimposed across much of the Northern Hemisphere. Our border is closed. Tourism has been wiped out. It was as big a foreign exchange earner as dairy before this happened. Huge disruption to shipping in and out, and air freight, of course. And the uncertainty is hard to overstate. As was mentioned late last week, we weren't even sure if we could hold this event. So pretty difficult times for businesses to plan ahead. And yet there's an aura of bulletproof about this economy. People seem to be feeling extremely confident. The housing market is booming. Business sentiment around investment intentions and employment and exports and own activity, all back where they were last year. You ask firms what their biggest problems are, and they say the same problems as last year, which is quite remarkable, led by finding skilled staff. So I think it's probably fair to say that much of the world would love to have our problems at the moment. But it's a very uncertain picture, so how is Treasury seeing the outlook?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon, and good to chat, and tēnā koutou katoa. So we have a very similar view at the Treasury to some of the main directions that you've just outlined. I mean, I'll make 3 points about the outlook. And the first one is that economic data continues to come in consistent with our more optimistic scenarios. New Zealand's had a very successful public health response, and so we've had less time in lockdown than was originally anticipated. We've also had success in the economic response, with more workers kept in jobs and more businesses kept afloat through the shock. I think we've seen a lot more resilience across a range of different indicators, from employment data to business confidence. And there's good news also in the last week or so with developments in vaccines. And while that's not changing our forecasts at the Treasury, it does provide a little more confidence that there is a way out of the pandemic. But the second point is that despite that good news, and it is good news, we need to remember that the economy has experienced the sharpest contraction on record. We've had a drop of 12.2% in GDP in the June quarter. Just to put that in perspective, the next largest drop was 2.4% in the early 1990s. And there's just still significant uncertainty about the outlook. And we think that many of the costs of the pandemic are yet to flow through the economy. So international tourism is seasonal. We're yet to enter the peak season. Some economic supports are unwinding, and we see further lockdowns in the US, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, and that will also flow through to New Zealand through trade and through confidence channels. So our view is that we expect unemployment will continue to rise, although not by as much as we thought back earlier in the days of the pandemic. We also think that it will take until probably 2022 until GDP recovers to pre-COVID levels. That's about the same amount of time it took in the GFC. And we do think it's likely there'll be some economic scarring, so we'll have probably a permanent reduction in the trajectory of GDP growth. And look, and the third point to make is just how uneven the impacts of COVID-19 have been right across the economy. So we see retail and accommodation businesses that have been hit particularly hard. And on the other hand, financial services is growing. Agriculture, public sector remains relatively robust. Some people, particularly young people, low-skilled workers, have been also hit particularly hard, and there is some evidence also women and Māori have been disproportionately impacted. And so that's really important in thinking through how we understand what sort of economic support is required to reach the people who are most affected.
Yeah, and I think the unevenness of the shock does go a long way to explain some of the weirdness that we're seeing. Like in our consumer confidence survey, we ask people, is it a good time to buy a major household item? So should I borrow $500 to buy a fridge at the moment? And that has really good correlation with retail sales. And at the moment, people are saying, no, the world's too uncertain. But then you ask them, is it a good time to buy a house? That's the ASB survey. And people go, heck yeah, best time since 2012. I'm really keen to borrow $500,000. So maybe we've got a whole lot of houses with no appliances in them. It's actually possible given the shipping disruptions we're seeing at the moment. But I think it's more likely to reflect that there are many people who have been completely unaffected by this. Their income's secure, they've got a bit of wealth in deciding what to do with it, and money is practically free. But there are others who have really been walloped quite hard by this. So I do think that does speak to a particular role for fiscal policy, whereas obviously monetary is quite broad brush. So how is Treasury thinking about the economic response now?
I should be clear at the outset that policy decisions are a matter for government, of course, and Treasury's role is to advise on that. I mean, it was very clear early on in the pandemic that a swift and strong response was needed, and on a scale at which none of us were really used to in working in fiscal policy for quite some time. I mean, I think, like for many others, it was an incredibly intense time at the Treasury. Other countries postponed their budgets, and we kind of had a rolling succession of them. I do think it's some of the toughest and also the most meaningful work that we've done. And I want to take the opportunity just to give a bit of a shout out to the team, because there are some in the audience there for some of the great work that they did. But look, the initial response was very much about helping workers to remain in jobs and helping businesses to stay afloat. And what we've seen is, I think the government's wages subsidy has been particularly successful in achieving that. And I think it's worth noting also for this audience that the construction sector had some of the highest take-up rates of the wages subsidy, and it's also had some of the fastest bounce backs in terms of economic activity. But what remains a case at the start of the pandemic, and is the case now, is that core to the economic response was the public health response. So we can look to other countries to see what happens when the virus gets out of control. And in New Zealand, we had initially a stricter lockdown than many other countries, but that also enabled a faster return to normality. So at the Treasury, we continue now to work closely with our health colleagues in thinking about the economic response and understanding how we can control the virus in a way that helps to still maximise safe economic activity. But in addition to the public health response, the economic response also has fiscal policy at the centre. We think ongoing fiscal support is critical to the recovery. Treasury has a historic amount of spending that's built into our forecasts. And government has been clear that it will spend more from the COVID fund, spend some of the unallocated COVID funds if it needs to. So we're watching the economy evolve very closely, and I think it's very important for policy to be nimble. Wouldn't surprise you to hear us say as a Treasury that also value for money in fiscal policy is incredibly important. We think that spending needs to deliver not just benefits in the short term, fiscal stimulus, but also long-term gains. As the Prime Minister said earlier this morning, it's about building back better and taking the opportunity to address some of the long-standing challenges that New Zealand faces: productivity, sustainability, and equity. And here I think that infrastructure really has a strong role to play. Infrastructure projects provide jobs and income in the short term, but infrastructure projects can also lead to investments that last for a long time, deliver benefits for productivity, help our cities, our places become more resilient, and lead to better wellbeing outcomes as well.
That all sounds great, but can we afford it?
So I remember when I first started at the Treasury, it was about a year ago, and I remember very clearly that net debt to GDP at that time was 19.2%. Seems like a very long time ago now. We expect over the next 4 years it'll be more than 50%. But our view at the Treasury is that those levels of debt are manageable. So bond costs are really low, and they're expected to remain low for some time. We have good market access and a really active investor base. And despite the increases in debt, New Zealand, compared to many other countries that we benchmark ourselves with, still is on the low side. So you see many countries in the OECD with levels of debt to GDP at more than 100%. So rather than focusing in on the levels of debt, our view is that it's more important at this point to focus on value for money from that debt. It is possible to get benefits to spending now for current generations as well as future generations that outweigh the costs if we have spending that does address some of the long-standing challenges that the economy faces. And also in thinking about debt, we need to think about sustainability as well. At this point, large deficits are needed to support the economy, large temporary deficits. But as always, we need to make sure that we maintain discipline on underlying revenue and expenses, and make sure that we can still manage to manage through some of the significant cost pressures that all government faces, like rising health costs and changing demographics, climate change, and so on.
It's extremely unfashionable to worry about debt at the moment. Globally, there does seem to be an increasing consensus that governments can and should spend at will, funded by printing money, perhaps even direct monetary financing. So cut out the middle guy, save some money for the taxpayer, and just print. I think Indonesia announced they were going to directly finance 30% of their deficit this year, and markets yawned. So free money. What's Treasury's view on that?
Yeah, well, sadly, we've looked carefully at this, but sadly, we really just don't think there's any free lunch there. So under monetary financing, of course, the government sells bonds to the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank buys those bonds and issues settlement cash. So as you say, it's effectively government printing money and then spending it. But what's important to remember is that that settlement cash, it sits on the balance sheet of the Crown as a liability in the same way that government bonds do, and we have to pay interest on settlement cash in the same way as we pay interest on government bonds. Settlement cash is part of net debt in the same way as government bonds are part of net debt. So in effect, really, monetary financing is just swapping one type of liability, government bonds, for another type of liability, which is settlement cash. So look, I mean, that's all a bit technical, but I think the key thing to remember is that monetary financing it's just not a magical source of free funding. And, in fact, it comes with some real downsides. So, it blurs fiscal and monetary policy. It can erode the independence of inflation targeting, and that can lead to higher inflation. And it can erode fiscal discipline, and that can lead to poorer quality spend. And in fact, what the Reserve Bank is doing now with its quantitative easing program, the large-scale asset purchases, actually has a very similar effect on the balance sheet to monetary financing, but without the same sorts of costs to economic institutions. And New Zealand, of course, has a long and proud tradition of really strong economic institutions, and we think that's important to maintain. So, right now we really see monetary and fiscal policy working in tandem together, effectively to support the recovery.
And I think you can see from what's happened since that first lockdown and how the second lockdown barely dented things, that monetary and fiscal policy have worked extremely well this year. But of course there is increasing debate about the channels through which monetary policy works in particular. And when businesses are nervous and the world is so uncertain, investment plans do tend to go on hold, whereas households tend to throw caution to the wind. And so we have this unprecedented situation of a housing boom at a time of a real negative income shock. And I think there's increasing concern about both the societal and the potential financial implications of that. But at least one thing I think everybody agrees on is that New Zealand does have an infrastructure deficit, and this is a great opportunity to address that. So how is Treasury thinking about the role of infrastructure in particular in this recovery?
Yep. So government has a $42 billion infrastructure program, and that is really providing a large boost to the economy as it recovers from the downturn. Timely delivery is really important in the recovery, and we've been supporting our minister in monitoring progress. But I think that the disruption of COVID has, it's provided an opportunity to really focus in on some of the changes to our infrastructure system that are already underway, but there's an opportunity to kind of accelerate and focus in on those more. So three that the Treasury is most interested in. I mean, first is just the importance of long-term and integrated strategies to guide infrastructure planning and delivery. And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues at the Infrastructure Commission for the great work that they're doing in really building up a 30-year national strategy for infrastructure. And at the next level down, integrated spatial planning across different levels of government and integrating different sectors. That's also going to be really critical to getting well-planned infrastructure and getting better well-being outcomes. I think the example of housing affordability is a good one here. Integrated spatial planning can really help to increase housing supply and relieve some of the pressure on house prices. But the second area of focus for Treasury and infrastructure is really robust project selection. So there I mean rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and Treasury uses its living standards framework to assess infrastructure projects as well. So that's really recognising that infrastructure delivers not just the physical asset, but it actually helps to promote environmental outcomes, social and human capital as well. Infrastructure can help to manage risk, in particular looking at resilience to climate change. And infrastructure can also affect distribution and equity across the economy. And I think, again, the example of infrastructure for housing is a good one, where infrastructure in the right place can really help to support housing markets. So we need to look at all of those different dimensions and make sure that it's projects that have the highest net benefit that are the ones that are funded. And the third area of focus for Treasury in infrastructure is really looking at the enablers of the system. And so for that, regulatory settings are key. For example, the proposed Resource Management Act reforms are likely to have a significant impact on infrastructure systems, again, including housing markets. And I think the experience that we've had during the pandemic with the fast track process in the RMA has shown that there's some real benefits from reform in that area. Other enablers, workforce, skills development, and infrastructure funding and financing are very much on Treasury's radar. And we've done quite a bit of work in infrastructure financing. For example, Treasury played a key role in some of the changes that have enabled councils to borrow for infrastructure using future revenue streams. So there's more that we engage on in infrastructure than that, but there's sort of a selection of the issues that are really important to us. It's fantastic to see that a lot of those issues are topics for the next 2 days in this forum, and so we're really looking forward to participating and hearing some really constructive discussion on those issues.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.